History is crowded with powerful voices: colonizers, emperors, intellectuals, politicians, reformers. But behind all these voices, there are countless voices who never reach the records of official history. Not because they are silent, but because nobody truly listened. Today's lecture explores one of the most powerful and groundbreaking essays in postcolonial theory, Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? This essay shakes the foundation of how we think about colonialism, representation, power, gender, and even history itself. Spivak asks a deeply disturbing question. When marginalized people try to speak, do we actually listen to them? Or the dominant system tries to translate, reshape, or silence them altogether? This essay moves through colonialism, Marxism, feminism, and philosophy. At its core lies a haunting concern: the systematic silencing of the oppressed, especially the subaltern women. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing well. If you are new to my channel, I am Dr. Riya Datto and I make videos on English literature, English language, and literary theories. If that is something of interest to you, consider subscribing and tag along. So without further ado, let us begin this lecture. In this lecture, I will not go line by line, but I will try to talk about the historical and theoretical background of this essay, the meaning of the word subaltern, Spivak's critique of Western intellectuals, representations and problems of speaking for others, the example of sati and colonial discourse, the case of Bhuvaneswari Bhaduri, feminism and subaltern women, the meaning of the famous conclusion, Can the Subaltern Speak? As well as the critical evaluation and contemporary relevance. So a lot to cover today. So let us not waste any more time. First, let us talk about the historical and intellectual background. To understand Spivak, we must understand the historical and political climate in which she was writing. This essay emerges from three major traditions. Number one is Marxism. Spivak draws heavily from Karl Marx, especially his concerns with class and oppression. Marxism studies how dominant classes control the economic and ideological systems. However, Spivak believes that the classical Marxism often ignores the colonized as well as the women. The second tradition is post-structuralism and deconstruction. Spivak was heavily influenced by Jacques Derrida. Deconstruction questions stable meaning and explores the contradiction within language as well as thought process. Spivak uses deconstruction to explore the hidden power structures inside Western intellectual discourse. The third tradition is post-colonial studies. This essay also responds to colonial history and imperial legacy. European colonial powers often say that they were quote unquote civilizing the colonized societies while simultaneously silencing their voices. Spivak asks, can people oppressed by colonialism truly represent themselves within system created by colonial power? That is a very powerful question to ask. Before we jump into any further, let us talk about what is the meaning of the word subaltern. This word subaltern comes from the military vocabulary, often meaning lower rank. But in post-colonial studies, this particular term has gained importance or other meaning, and it has been first used by Antonio Gramsci. For Gramsci, subaltern means a group of people who are actually outside the social, political, or economic power. And who are these people? These people are peasants, workers, colonized people, tribal communities, oppressed castes, and marginalized women. However, Spivak uses this term in more radical way. For her, the subaltern is not only oppressed. This subaltern is someone who does not have the access to intellectual power, someone without any representation, and someone whose voices cannot enter the dominant discourse without any distortion. So in that way, subaltern is structurally silenced. Let us see how Spivak critiques the Western intellectuals. So one of the central themes or one of the central arguments of Spivak is our criticism of Western intellectuals, especially Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze. Spivak argues that these thinkers claim to allow oppressed people to speak for themselves, but actually they continue to speak for them. So you can understand this creates a paradox. So even when the intellectuals try to liberate the marginalized voices, so they end up often interpreting them, categorizing them, or even translating them into academic discourse. So what happens? The oppressed remained trapped within the system of elite knowledge. Spivak also believes that the Western intellectuals sometimes romanticize the idea of the oppressed. They imagine the worker, the peasant, the colonized as pure revolutionary subjects. But real marginalized people are far more fragmented and constrained. Let us now talk about representation and a core theoretical problem as discussed by Spivak. This particular section is actually the central of this essay. Spivak discusses the two meanings of representation derived from Marx. Number one is representation as speaking form. She uses a German word Vertretung. What does it mean? It means political representation. For example, a politician represents the citizens or an activist speaks for the marginalized societies or communities. And another kind of representation is the representation as representation. The German word she uses is Darstellung, which means portraying or depicting someone. For example, literature represents reality, media represents social group. So Spivak argues that intellectuals confuse these two forms. When scholars claim to give voices to marginalized people, what they often do? They replace those voices, they construct images of them, or they speak in their place. So what does an intellectual become here? The intellectual becomes a ventriloquist. So the subaltern voice echoes through the elite discourse like a sound filtered through heavy machinery. So by the time we hear it, it never belongs to the original speaker. Let's talk about Spivak's idea of colonialism and the example of sati she gives here. Spivak develops her argument through the colonial debate around sati. What was this sati? Sati was this historical practice in which the widow immolated herself in the pyre of her husband's funeral. British colonial officials condemned this practice and it became and eventually outlawed it in the year 1829. But Spivak asks us to examine how this debate was actually formed. So there is this colonial narrative in which the Britishers represented themselves as white men saving brown women from brown men. So what does it do? This allows colonialism to appear as morally justifying. The colonizers portrayed the Indian women as helpless victims needing the Western support. And there is this native patriarchal narrative. And what does it say? So at that time, traditional patriarchal structure said that sati represented female devotion, purity, and religious honor. And women, they were trapped between colonial discourse and indigenous patriarchy. But what is common in both cases? In both cases, men spoke. And it is all about the women. The women, they disappeared. Nobody asked about them. What do they want? What do they feel? So their voices became like ghosts in this competing narratives. So Spivak writes here, the funeral fire became not only a literal pyre but also a symbolic furnace where female agency was consumed. She also gives the example of Bhuvaneswari Bhaduri. So this particular section is one of the most emotionally powerful section of this essay, and it concerns a young woman named Bhuvaneswari Bhaduri. So she was involved in anti-colonial revolutionary movements in colonial India, and she was assigned to carry out a political assassination. But she eventually commits suicide before completing the mission. However, she deliberately waits until menstruation before killing herself. Why? Because she wanted to signal that her death was not caused by an illicit pregnancy, which was the common assumption surrounding female suicide. So her act attempted communication. It was a coded political statement. Yet her family and the society completely misunderstood her act. Years later, her suicide was still interpreted through patriarchal lenses, and this becomes crucial for Spivak. Even when the subaltern women attempted to speak through her body, through her action, through symbolism, society cannot hear them. The message collapses before reaching understanding. Let us now talk about the subaltern women. So, Spivak repeatedly emphasizes that subaltern women are the most marginalized group of people. Why? Because they go through multiple oppressions: the oppression of colonialism, class oppression, patriarchal oppression, and epistemic oppression. So, this may create what we call layered invisibility. The subaltern woman is caught in a tightening web. Empire controls her politically, patriarchy controls her socially, elite discourse controls her intellectually. Thus, Spivak famously writes, the subaltern as female is often more deeply in shadow. So, this metaphor of shadow is very important here. The subaltern women exist historically, materially, physically, but dominant system prevents the visibility. So let us talk about what does the subaltern cannot speak actually mean. So this particular line is most famous and controversial in this essay. So, what does it mean? Did Spivak actually say that the marginalized people are actually mute? No, that would be absurd, wouldn't it? Subaltern people obviously speak language, write, resist, protest, act. So, what does Spivak means? What she means is far more complex than this. So, what she means is that subaltern people cannot speak within the dominant systems in a way that guarantees recognition or understanding. So, what happens? Their voices are interpreted, translated, appropriated, misunderstood, or simply erased. Speech doesn't require only sound, it requires more than that. It requires structures of listening, institutional recognition, and social legitimacy. So, without these structures, speech vanishes. So, it becomes what we might all call unreceived transmission, like a radio signal lost in storm. Let's talk about the epistemic violence. So this is an important term, epistemic violence. So this refers to the violence done through knowledge system. So colonialism did not only mean conquering territories. It also means controlled education, rewritten histories, categorized culture, and also the definition which knowledge is counted as legitimate. So colonized people were represented through Western frameworks. Thus, the oppressed were not only politically dominated, but they were intellectually reconstructed. So Spivak argues that, which is right, I also think, that this is another form of violence. Let's talk about Spivak and feminism. So she also critiques the mainstream Western feminism. She believes that some Western feminists universalizes the experience of all women. So it means the Western feminists, they assume that all women experience oppression similarly, or it also means to treat the third world women as passive victims. And Spivak opposes this simplification. An upper class Western woman and a poor colonized woman do not occupy the same historical position. Therefore, feminism must attend to race, class, colonial history, language, as well as global power relations. So I have come across questions from a lot of people that why Spivak is so difficult to read. There are several reasons. First of all is the interdisciplinary nature of this essay. It goes through Marxism, postcolonialism, feminism, philosophy, historiography, psychoanalysis. So obviously it becomes quite difficult to go through all this. Then there is her deconstructive method. Her writing deliberately avoids simple conclusions. So she deliberately wants the readers to confront the paradoxes and the contradictions. So another problem is that Spivak often fears that writing in this simplistic language might repeat the same violence of representation that she is critiquing in this essay. Thus, the essay itself performs complexity. So we can say that reading Spivak means walking through the hall full of mirrors where each image is questioning the previous one. Many people admired this essay, many criticize it. Some argue that Spivak leaves little room for resistance. So they ask the question, if the subaltern cannot speak, then how can a political change occur? And some critics also say that the dense style she uses that is difficult for ordinary readers. So that is an irony that an essay which is about the marginalized voices become accessible to intellectual elites only. And some scholars argue that the oppressed people, they create their space for having a voice or having a resistance, like oral traditions, folklore, and the grassroots movements. The subaltern can speak in unofficial spaces. So despite all this criticism, the essay remains a foundational because it forces people to ask ethical questions about representation. So, why do we still study this essay today? Why is it still relevant? So, we can apply these ideas to marginalized people, the workers, refugees, indigenous communities, domestic workers, displaced population, and digitally silenced communities, and many more. So we live in the age of social media. So even in this age, the true visibility is not guaranteed. Algorithms, political structures, media institutions still shape whose voices circulate widely. A viral voice is not always an empowered voice. Sometimes it can be curated visibility. So let us conclude this essay. So we can simply say that this essay is an ultimate ethical warning. What does it teach? It teaches us that power shapes knowledge. Representation is never innocent, and silence is often produced structurally rather than naturally. Spivak does not ask us to abandon political engagement. Instead, she asks us to cultivate critical awareness. So before speak for others, we must ask, who is speaking, through which institution, in what language, under what power structure, and who remain unheard even now. So this essay leaves us with an unsettling truth. Sometimes the greatest form of oppression is not simply the denied speech, but being spoken over completely, that one's own voice becomes historically inaudible. So that was the lecture on Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and for more videos like this, keep an eye on my channel. Thank you. Bye bye.